and American mercenaries, and I'm a good Muslim, and Najibullah made a point of going to the mosque and praying and sort of making a big show that, communism? What communism? We're not a communist country. But of course, it was too late. It was already irretrievable. But that was the ploy after 1985. So at that point, yes. But the really heavy communizing period is between 1978 and 1985.
And so it was a half-hearted effort at best on their way out the door.
Exactly. Okay, so next. Yeah, that was my Afghan demining team that would have been trained in Pakistan by the United Nations. Just moving around everything with these toys just to make it possible for refugees to return and recover their homes and farms. Next. Now, these are pictures also like you will never see again. I think your name is John, right? You're very interested in certain aspects of Soviet policy. This is the kind of thing that you can find in Mongolia, in Kazakhstan, or in Ukraine. That is, I was here with Ismail Khan's people in the autumn of 1992, just as they were beginning excavations. What this is a valley just out of earshot of Herat Oasis. To this valley, every night, they would bring by truckloads of prisoners, whole families, in some cases, shoot them in the nape of the neck, which is the typical Soviet way. Chinese do it too. I think the Chinese add the added perversion of you send the bill for the bullet to the family. You shoot in the nape of the neck, you throw in the ditch, and you bulldoze. Outside Kabul, some of those things were making too much noise, so they would just bulldoze people alive into these ditches. This is the standard, typical 20th century technique, which was so perfected by the Nazis, known as Nacht und Nebel, night and fog. It's even more efficient when you're repressing not to tell people, not to tell families, not to tell loved ones if prisoners have been executed or not. It's what the Argentine generals used too, la técnica de los desaparecidos, the disappeared ones. If you don't know if your loved ones have been executed, then you think twice about rising in insurrection because you're hoping for some kind of leniency. Maybe our loved ones will return from the night and fog. Well, this is what we found. Come, next one. I think you get the idea. There were about 1,300 people in this one. And if you actually see not only men, but definitely women too, Azim, you will recognize that these are chowdhuries. So in some cases, whole families were being exterminated. This was during the peak of the communist terror of 1978, early 1980, with the telltale bullet hole, back of the neck, right in the nape here. Next, that was one of Ismail Khan's soldiers. In some cases, the blindfolds were so tight that they stayed on the skulls. So truly, this is no joke. Next. Yeah, the telltale execution method. One of Ismail Khan's soldiers. Next. So you can see why you have a different look on people's faces. Next. So this is a picture of Herat before 1978. And this was the typical girls' uniform. Schoolgirls. Sorry, school uniform. No face cloth, just the head cloth. And she's traveling to school in the local carriage. Next. But this is what Herat looks like today. Much less liberal than it was in 1978. The reaction has meant the return, almost everywhere, of the full chowdhury. You have women trying to break out of this, as you know, in Kabul. But outside of Kabul, this has pretty much become the rule everywhere. Next. Since I worked so much with French and United Nations medical teams, I just wanted to show you a typical hospital, what had been a modern hospital in 1978, and which such hospitals right around Herat City looked like in 1992. So here's our first UN supply truck. We look at the next one. Next. Well, the problem is, this is not being addressed yet. That's what your standard hospital looks like in Afghan prefectures. Next. Okay, one of the patients. Next. Okay, well that is Herat Hospital that we rehabilitated with our French medical team between 1992 and 1994, well, until the Taliban took over, so that wasn't too bad. Next. Some of our patients. Next. Patients again. Next. And this is where I have to give Ismail Khan, warlord, credit. As civil war broke out between the collapse of the communist government in 1992 and the conquest of Herat by the Taliban in 1995, this is the kind of thing that Ismail Khan not only allowed, but indeed encouraged. There were girls' schools in Herat. Okay, the guy's a despot. Okay, he's a warlord. But this was happening, and this is testimony to it. And it's a lot better than a lot of the things that have happened since. Next. So I just, as in all these slideshows, one has to remind people that we're not just talking about a land of misery and war, but it was also the seat of brilliant civilizations in the past. And Herat was particularly famous in the 15th century for its school of miniature paintings. The painters of Herat were the most famous of the entire Islamic world. So we might bear that in mind, even though nobody in Afghanistan can see these paintings anymore. They're in India, they're in Turkey, they're in Germany, they're in Austria, they're in England, they're in France, they're in the United States. Not one is left on Afghan soil. And probably just as well, because if any had been left and the Taliban had found them, they would have destroyed them. And I always like to show reproductions of these things in Herat today when I go and give lectures, because it shows Herat's great mosque, it's the story of Layli or Majnun, and boys and girls in the Quranic school. So you've got everything. Boys, girls, Quranic school, learning how to read in the 15th century. I've shown these to Taliban leaders. They go, this is Afghan? Well, that's what it was done 500 years ago.
In many of the other
Yes.
pieces we've seen were similar to this, the figures did not have faces, but here they do.
They all had faces.
Oh, they did. I was just
yes.
not seeing them. Okay.
You weren't seeing them. Next. That was one. The first one's from 1440. This is by the great master Bizad of Herat in 1494. It shows the same story, the same scene, and really to make people uncomfortable. You see that the focus of the boy's love is going to be this young girl who has just taken off her burqa. Burqa ze jamali khish ba dausht. She has lifted the burqa from her beauty, and she stands revealed in the mihrab, the niche of prayer itself, because that is what it says in quotation from the Quran, Surah 3, وَهُوَ قَائِمٌ يُصَلِّي فِي الْمِحْرَابِ. Upright is he who prayeth towards the mihrab. That means that in Sufi mysticism, she is the mirror of the divine. And as a worshipper, you will not understand the mystery of God until you can understand through the emotion of love that God can be mirrored in a beautiful face, a young man's or a young woman's. That's the paradox of Sufi poetry, and you can be sure that this is absolutely forbidden wherever the Wahhabis or the Taliban take over. They consider this to be absolute heresy, but this was taught as standard Islamic philosophy for 800 years. Next. So this was one of the great monuments that survived from the 15th century in Herat in 1978. From that great 15th century period, This is the tomb of